Hello, in today's video we are going to be doing something highly illegal in Maya. Some of you people have already made this joke in our comment section, but we're going to be making, we're going to be doing a donut tutorial in Maya. I know, shocking and terrible. Please call the police. But hey, so you guys requested it, so we're going to do it. So what we're going to run through to begin with is we're going to go on how to actually make the donut shape, how to give it a bit more life, how to add icing, we're going to add sprinkles, and we're also going to do some lighting and rendering to finally display it all. So I know typically this is a Blender thing, but we're going to do it in Maya as well because we'd had a few requests for it, and I just think it's a little fun exercise, isn't it? So first of all, let's go to the poly modeling shelf, and we're going to create a polygon torus. That's it. Tutorial over. We're done. Thanks for watching. But no, in all seriousness, this is just the shape you'll go for to start with because it's called a torus. It's also just a donut, isn't it? So that gets us most of the way there. I like to scale it up a little bit first just because the grid's quite big and by default it comes in quite small. So I'm going to scale it up and then just pull it up with the move tool to have it just sit on the bottom of the grid there. First things first, before we start any project, including with this donut, the most important thing to look at is reference. So I like to use a great bit of software called PureRef, and I've just found a bunch of different pictures of donuts from different angles. So we've got them from the top, kind of from the side, one directly from the side. And what I'm looking for really is just the shape of the donut as well. So we could create one that's a bit more like this, with a bigger ring in the middle, bigger hole in the middle. I'm going to create kind of a thicker looking like donut that has a bit of bite to it, so I'm going to create something a bit more like this thick boy up here. This is all sprinkles, or not sprinkles, this is all sugar coated. We're going to do like an actual icing glaze, so get some reference for that too. And I would say when you're looking for a reference, find a shape of a donut that you'd like to recreate and then use that. And then one of the reasons why we're using reference is that we want to make sure that this looks realistic, right? We could just go ahead and create a donut from memory, but in all likelihood, you're going to miss out on things, right? Like you might not see these little bumpy creases here, and you might not remember to add this kind of white line here from where the donuts have like cooked unevenly in the oil or however they're cooked. You might forget to add these creases, or you miss out on this slight like alteration in the color where we've got a bit of red and orange too on top of everything else. So very, very important whether you're making donuts or spaceships. References. So let's go ahead and use this base to create our donut. So once we've created it, I'm going to come to the poly torus here under the channel box and layer editor, and I'm just going to increase the section radius, I believe it is. And this will change the thickness of your donut, right? So if I was to put this down to 0.1, we have a very, very sad looking donut here. You wouldn't buy this probably. But I'm going to increase this up to maybe, might be a bit too much. Let's increase it to 0.7. Maybe even slightly higher. 0.75. So that is a real thick looking donut now. Okay. Like I said, I want to make something a bit like this. So I'm going to increase that. But your mileage may vary. If you want to have a thinner donut, you could have it at 0.4. Or even just keep it at the default 0.5. And that works too. All donuts are good. Except for maybe the 0.1 one. So from here, we've already done a lot of the job for us, right? We kind of have the shape of our donut, but we don't want to just leave it there because that's a bit boring. One thing I'm going to do as well on top of the section radius is I'm actually just going to increase the subdivisions in the axis as well to 32. That's the divisions around this way, right? Rather than the height. We could increase the height as well, but we don't really need more divisions in that way. I kind of just want these exterior faces here to be a little bit more square, so I might increase that up to like 38. Just to give us a little bit more geometry to play with. Once we're happy with that, I'm going to come up to edit. We're going to freeze the transform, or modify, sorry. We're going to freeze the transforms and then reset the transforms. And then we're going to go to edit and then delete all by type. And then history, just to make sure everything's clean here before we do anything else. Also in the outliner here, if you don't know how to open this up, come up to Windows and go to Outliner. I'm going to rename this to donut, just like that. But you can call it whatever you want. Call it Steve if you like. That's okay too. So what we're going to do now is actually create the icing. Oh no, first of all, let's add a bit of wobbliness, a bit of lumpiness to our donut. So right now it's very, very perfect looking. we're going to use the soft select tool to add some bumpiness to our donut. So if you come to the modeling toolkit on the side here, and then just go to vertex selection mode, and click anywhere on your donut, okay? So by default, you'll be able to move some vertices around like this, okay? And that's okay. But if you use B on your keyboard, you'll see your donut kind of light up like this in orange and red. It might be a bit smaller, maybe something like this. This is soft select. If you go ahead and pull one of those vertices now, you can see it's pulling up a little bit more of that area. This is great for when you need to edit multiple vertices or multiple parts of a model at once. It's especially good for soft objects like cloth and, of course, donuts. So you can hold down B on your keyboard and then hold down the middle mouse click at the same time on your mouse and drag from left to right. Not up and down, it doesn't really do much, but go from left to right. So if you see here I drag to the right, it's increasing in intensity. So this part here, if you kind of imagine it like heat, the yellow part is what is being most affected, whereas the red is least affected. And then if you see here where it's just blue on the outside, that is not affected at all. So if I was to increase this massively like this and then pull one of these, you can see it's pulling most of the donut, but it is kind of deforming it a little bit. So we just want a little bit, maybe something like this. And I'm just going to start at random, making sure it is at random, because sometimes when we're doing things, we don't actually work randomly. I think the human brain has a bit of a hard time doing things 100%. We kind of like things to be symmetrical, so you almost have to think against yourself, if that makes sense, to make things a little bit more uneven. So I'm going to pull it around a bit on the outside as well, just so it's not perfectly round. We don't want it to be boring, and we want it to look a bit more realistic as well. So you can see we've got some lumpiness there too. Maybe we'll pull this one in a little bit, just to break up that shape somewhat. Maybe as well we'll reduce that soft select just to have a bit more finer detailed bumpy bumps. A bit more up here. Maybe we'll put that in a little bit. Maybe in here as well we'll have this, because that's also perfectly circular. We can't forget that bit too. Get a bit more oval maybe. Something like that. Okay, so that is how you add a little bit of bumpiness to your donut. If you press free on the keyboard, by the way, you can smooth preview it, and you can see here that we have a lot more subdivisions now. So if free will do a smooth preview, but it doesn't actually smooth your donut. It doesn't change the topology. You can see it's the same, but it's just a good way to visualize things, and it's better than actually subdividing, especially when you don't have to, which of course we don't really need to in this case. I'm just going to bring this one up a little bit. Okay, so that is our base donut model, and that would be great, but we want to add icing too, so how do we do that? First things first, I would say at this stage, go ahead and save your project. I'm just going to press Control S and then navigate to where I want to save this. And I'm just going to call this something like donut, just in case you lose anything and it crashes, which Maya can do from time to time. Bit of a temperamental piece of software occasionally. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's go ahead and with our donut selected, I'm just going to press Control D to duplicate. And you can see here in our outline now we have donut and donut 1. We want this to be our icing. So the second one we're going to rename our icing, or as icing. And in order to actually get this to sit on top and not just be an entire extra donut, we're going to come over to the face select mode here. Okay, and I'm going to press space on the keyboard. And this is going to bring up multiple views. If that doesn't happen, just click this button over here on the left hand side, and then you'll be able to get the same thing. And then we're going to come to this view down here, we're going to press space again. So this is one of the orthographic views. And basically what that means is, instead of being in perspective like we are here where we can see everything and rotate around, orthographic is kind of just like, if you imagine it's a 2D world, it's a 2D projection. You actually can't rotate your screen. If I was to hold down Alt and left click, you can only actually zoom in and pan as well, and that's it. But it's great for selecting things quickly and easily and making sure you're getting the right things. So if I just hold down left click, and we're gonna, with face select mode on, we're gonna select the entire top half of the donut. Or in fact, no, we'll select the entire bottom half of the donut. Press space and then come back to perspective just to make sure we've selected the right bits. You can also press 4 on your keyboard, or press this little button up here to go into wireframe mode, and then that just allows you to see if you have got everything selected that you need to. And once we've done this, we're just going to go ahead and press delete. So now we have our icing on top of our donut. So we have these two separate bits. And that's all well and good, but we don't have any thickness on this right now. So it wouldn't be very good icing, would it? It's kind of, there's not really a whole lot there. We want this to have some thickness to it. because it's a thick donut. We're going to come over to the modeling toolkit and we're going to click on extrude. You can also press Control E on the keyboard if you want to do that quickly. Then once this comes up, we're going to go ahead and increase the thickness. Little tip as well, if you want this, because you might notice if you just left click and drag on this to the right to increase the extrude, it comes out really quickly. This is way too much icing. You would be a bit alarmed, I think, if you had this. It looks more like a mushroom. If I just Control Z that, you can hold down Control while doing this, and it just gives you a bit finer control over it. So I'm going to do that. Just to have a good amount of icing, but not a crazy amount. Maybe we'll go for something like this. You can also just type in here if you want as well, if I did 0.15 or something. I'm going to go for 0.18. Okay, so that is how you add the icing for the top. If we were to just go ahead and press 3 on this to preview it, and the same with donut, there you go, you kind of already got the ice donut look going on. But you can see if I pan down here, we're getting this massive gap, and you wouldn't actually have that realistically, would you? So there's a few extra things we can do to fix that. So what we're going to do is I'll just press 1 again on the keyboard to remove the smooth preview. And I'm going to come over to the modeling toolkit again, and we're going to go to the multi-cut tool. I'm going to hold down Control, and I'm just going to add an extra edge in here. Okay. Now if I smooth preview this, you can see it's not quite as bad. There is still a little bit of a gap. But what we can do then instead is we can actually go to edge select mode, and then we're just going to pull this in a little bit. We're just going to scale this down. And then if we smooth preview it again, you can see here now that's contacting a lot more nicely. Okay. What if we want to add some little droplets to this? So to do that, we're going to use the extrude. So you can do this in smooth preview if you like. I'm not going to. I generally like to do this outside of smooth preview just to see how things are looking. And we're going to come over to the face select tool. And then we're going to select these two faces there to begin with. And like we did before to add thickness to the icing, we can come over and press extrude or press Control E. And I am just going to pull this straight down like so, and then maybe in a little bit like that. Okay, now if I smooth preview this again, we have a little drip drip. Maybe we'll add another one over here. We'll come back to face select mode again. And then we'll extrude this again, and we'll just bring it down. Maybe with this one, though, I want it to be a bit longer. And I also want it to be a bit smaller. Maybe it comes in a bit like that. But then what if, actually, it also comes out a bit again? And goes a bit wider. Okay. And then back in again. Something like that. Now if I go ahead and smooth preview this, we might have to make some little adjustments here with the vertex select mode. And again, you can use soft select just to pull things out, move them around. We now have a droplet that kind of gets a bit thinner in the middle and then a bit wider towards the end, which you do get when like things like with icing, right? If you've looked at your reference, you can see that you kind of get it. It's a bit like wider towards the end, isn't it? So we can do something like that. So go ahead and add a few more droplets. Droopies, whatever you want to call them. I might add a slightly bigger one here. Have this come down like that. And then just make sure you're pulling that back in so that it sits nicely. Then maybe I'll have a bit come down off of here too. Just get creative with it. You also don't have to add icing if you don't want to. That's okay too. Maybe we'll have something like that. And again, I'm just pressing 3 on the keyboard intermittently just to see how that's working. Maybe we'll have a long, wide one. It gets smaller. And again, just pressing 4 on the keyboard to go into wireframe mode to check if that's all lining up. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with those droplets. And that's essentially how you model the base of the donut. So that will be it for this video. In the next one, I am going to go ahead and show you how to add sprinkles on top. And then the episode after that, we'll get into doing the shading and the rendering as well, and the lighting too. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next part tomorrow. Hello guys, and welcome to part 2 of our donut modeling tutorial, our highly illegal donut modeling tutorial in Maya. So last we left off, we'd created the icing and the base donut shape. We've given it some droopy droopies and a bit of wobble. I've gone ahead and added in a little bit more wobble just to break up some of these straight lines, just using the same soft selection that we were using before. But in this episode, what we're going to do is go ahead and actually add some sprinkles on top. So before we do that, we're currently in smooth preview with this. We press 3 on the keyboard. I'm going to press 1 just to take that out. And I'm going to subdivide this one more time just to lock in that shape. Again, the same with the donut. We want to keep the subdivision levels the same across both of them. Just makes it easier to work with. So once we've done that, let's go ahead and start making some sprinkles. So these are the specific kind of sprinkles that we're going to make, and you can see they come in various different colors, but we'll get to that later. But they also come in a bunch of different shapes and sizes. We've got the kind of these long, thin ones, some shorter ones. We've also got this squiggly banana-looking boy here that we'll probably do. So what we're going to do is we'll start out just by creating one sprinkle. For the time being, we'll just come to our outliner, select both of these, and press H just to hide those, and then we will create a sprinkle. So we're going to go ahead and create a cylinder. By default, when you create a cylinder, if I come to the channel box editor, it's going to have around 20 divisions unless you've changed it. This we could get away with, but it's going to be a little bit high considering we're going to have a lot of sprinkles. We don't really want this to be a huge amount. So we're just going to go ahead and do 8 subdivisions for the time being. It's much more manageable, much more reasonable, won't slow your scene down as much. What we're also going to do is just use the rotate tool, and I'm going to hold down J so that angle snaps just to rotate that 90 degrees so it lies flat. Okay? And then, again, we're going to use the scale tool, and I'm just going to make that a little bit longer, like so. So that's our first sprinkle. Currently, it's very, very large, though. So I'm going to go ahead and do Modify, Freeze Transforms, just to reset all of this. And I'm going to reduce the scale. If I Shift select all of these in the channel box, we can change them all at once. I'm going to change this down to something like 0.1. Okay, we might need to scale that down again later, but for the time being, that'll be okay. Then let's just freeze the transforms on that again. The other thing that we can change is, right now you can see this looks very, very angular. So we obviously want this to be smooth, right, and round. So we're going to go ahead and go to the edge selection mode in the modeling toolkit. Just select all these edges, then come up to mesh display and soften edge, just to soften those normals a little bit. Okay, so this is our long one. Let's go ahead and create a short one as well. It's real nice and easy, just scaling down these cylinders. And we'll also create a curved one. So the best way to do this is we'll just copy the long one that we have. We're going to use the multi-cut tool, and I'm going to hold down Control and a middle mouse click just to add one in the middle. Again, another one here, and again, another one here, and then maybe we'll add a few more just in between. The middle mouse click, when you're holding down Control, allows you to place them evenly distributed instead of having to eyeball it. So once we've added a few edge loops, we're going to come up to Deform. We're going to go to non-linear and then bend. It's going to bring up this handle here. What we want to do is go to the rotate tool and just rotate this so it lies flat with your cylinder. If you can't see it anymore, that's okay. It is still there. We can press 4 on the keyboard to go into wireframe mode. You can see that it is still in there in the cylinder. Okay. We're then going to go back to the channel box layer editor, and you can see now we have this new input down here. Input down here called bend, and we have a curvature input here. So if I just select that, and maybe let's just type in 1. Okay, you can see that does a little bit, but not a whole lot. If you instead just click on here and hold down middle mouse click and then drag from left to right, you can see it's now bending, kind of like this, right? It's like a floppy fish. We want to add a bit of bend to this. So right now it's bending up in this direction, which is okay, but I want it to bend this way instead, right? Lying flat. So we'll just rotate this again in the y-axis this time. Hold down J to angle snap that, and we'll just rotate it until the x-axis is pointing up. You can see here as well on the right, we've got 90 and 90 in y. So now if we do the curvature, it's going that way. So we'll just go ahead and do maybe something like 60% there. And once you're happy with that, come back to Modify, go to Freeze Transforms, or sorry, before that, go to Edit, Delete All by Type History, just to clear that deformation, and go Modify and then Freeze Transforms. Okay. So make sure all the transforms on these guys are frozen, and we're just going to bring them all back to the center of the grid. Okay, holding down X to snap those, and then we'll just freeze those transforms again before we do anything else. Okay, so I'm going to unhide the donut and the icing. Okay. I'm just pressing 4 again to go into wireframe mode. You can see we have our sprinkles down there. They look around about a decent size, so I'm not too unhappy about that. Then what we're going to do next is we're going to distribute them on the donut. And you might be thinking, how do we do that? You know, am I going to have to drag these up and then place these all manually? Like so, and then like Control D and duplicate, and then turn around like this, and so on. And we could do that, but then we'd be here for a million years, and no one wants to do that, right? Unless you're absurdly patient, but I'm not. So there's a much easier way that we can do this. Okay, and we're going to use something called Mesh, which you can find in a little tab over here. If you don't have this tab, come to Windows, go to Settings and Preferences, and go to the Plugin Manager. Then from here, just type in Mesh, and then that will bring up this plugin here. Just make sure you click Loaded and then Auto Load, so that will start each time, and then that should bring that tab up over there. Okay, so if I just go ahead and hide the donut and the icing, I'm going to select these 3 cylinders that we've made for our sprinkles, and I'm going to hit this button here on the Mesh tab. That's going to create a mesh network, and you can see it's just duplicated what looks like 3 of the shorter sprinkles out in this direction, in the x-axis. And that's just the start, so we're going to go ahead and tweak this. If you click on your mesh network here, and then come to the attribute editor just down here on the right hand side, there's a few different tabs. So we have Mesh 1. Now this is essentially where you can add a bunch of different nodes. Mesh is node based, and all of these have very different things that they do. They do look a bit overwhelming, but don't worry, we're not really going to be using too many of these today. The one we're looking for right now, because obviously we only have the short sprinkle, and we want all the 3 sprinkles that we've just made. So how do we do that? We can go to ID, add ID node. Okay, and you'll now see that it's changed. So now we have all 3 of our sprinkles. We have the short one here, the curved one, and the long one. All right. But that's all great, but how do we actually get that onto our mesh, onto our donut? So let's go ahead and unhide the donut. Okay, come back to your mesh network, and then go to this node here, Mesh Distribute. So the distribution type by default is just set to linear, but if you click this drop down, there's a whole bunch of different options, but the one we're looking for is Mesh. Okay, and you might have figured out where we're going with this. We're going to hold down middle mouse click on the outliner in the icing, drag that over to the input mesh, and just drop it into this box here. And you can see now what's happened is it's put our sprinkles on top of the icing. We've got one down here, one up here, and one up here, okay? Now, if I were to drag this number of points, by default it's just 3, and if we had 6 sprinkles it'd be 6, so this number of points adjusts to however many input meshes you put in. We did 3 sprinkles, so we have 3 points. But we can adjust this. If I increase this up to something like 100, you can see now we have a lot more sprinkles on top of our donut. Okay, we can... Unfortunately, the slider here only goes up to 100, but we can also type something in manually. You know, I could type this, put in 1,000, and then we have a bajillion different sprinkles. Okay, so this is how we would do this, but if I go ahead and just select the icing, and then the mesh here that's created by Mesh, and just isolate that, you can see it's adding a bunch on the inside of the icing, and you wouldn't do that, right? You would sprinkle them on top. So how do we get around this? So if I just press Control 1 again to unisolate everything, I'm just going to select the icing, okay? I'm going to duplicate it. Just press Control 1 to isolate that for a moment. And I'm going to go to Face Select mode in the modeling toolkit. And I'm just going to click one of these, then Shift click and delete this entire string of faces here. Okay, and then we'll just make sure that we've got on all of those. Make sure to do the interior one here too. And then we can delete this interior set of faces. Probably get rid of some of these too. Okay. Now, the reason why we're doing this is because we don't want to have sprinkles appearing on the underside. We only want them on the top side. So if we instead press Control 1 again to unisolate, okay, come back to your mesh network, go to the attribute editor, and under the input mesh, instead of just taking the icing, let's take this new icing one that we made and just pop that into the input mesh. What that will now do is, if we now isolate these two, you can see they're only appearing on the outside of the icing, okay? No longer on the inside. Then we can just hide this additional icing that we made, because we don't need that at the moment. But make sure to keep it for the time being, so that this can stay connected. Okay, so that's all well and good, but everything's looking a bit same, right? It's all going in one direction. Everything's going in a straight line. Things are kind of clumping together and it looks a bit weird. So how can we make this look better? We'll come back to the mesh network. We'll come to Mesh 1 tab, and we're going to add a random node here, okay? Just click that, and then go to Add Random Node. And that's going to make everything sort of explode. Now, the reason why that's happened is because if you look at the right-hand side in your attribute editor, you can see we have a bunch of different inputs. So we have the position in X, Y, and Z, the same for rotation and scale. So by default, there's going to be a value of 1 in the position for X, Y, and Z, just to do a bit of randomness right off the bat. So if we were to just zero all these out with a slider, it will go back to normal. Okay, but you can see here, if I start adjusting some of these, it's starting to randomly propagate them out into the x-axis. The trick with this is to have like pretty low values, at least for the position, because otherwise things are going to very, very quickly float off of your donut like this, and that's not what we want. But some of the best things that we can take, that we can use here are the scale and rotation. So if I were to just, maybe add some random rotation into some of these, that's now going to make the sprinkles look a little bit more randomly placed. Okay. Maybe after introducing a bit of rotation, we can also do some scale. I don't want to do too much with this. Maybe we'll just do 0.1 in each. Just to introduce a little bit of offsetting. Sometimes I like to turn on absolute scale off and turn on uniform scale just to add a bit more difference. I'm thinking as well these sprinkles might be a bit too big, so if we want to reduce the size of these overall, we can actually select all of our original sprinkles. They'll be hidden at the moment. Mesh just does that whenever you create a mesh network, and if we just come back here and maybe reduce the size of these down to 0.7, it's going to go ahead and actually update all of those sprinkles, and that looks a bit more reasonable. So I'm liking this a little bit more, but things still look a bit sparse in places. There's a few too many down here. I'm not too fond of that. So we'll come back to the Mesh Distribute node. And under this Distribute section, there's a tick box here called Use Face Area. If you just turn that on, it's going to slightly more evenly distribute sprinkles for us in a little bit more of an even pattern. So this is looking a bit better. If you don't like how things seem to just be sticking out in random angles, again, just go ahead and play with the random node here until things look a bit more reasonable. You could just get rid of the rotation altogether, but I would encourage you to have a little bit, at least in one of the axes, just so things don't look so perfect, right? Even if it's just a bit like that. Okay. Something else as well you can change is the transformation space. By default, it'll be set to world. If you want things to lie a little bit better on the icing, just change that to local as well. You can see now that even though we add rotation, it's kind of just sitting a little bit better on top of things. And that looks a bit more natural to me, I think. Okay, so once you're happy with your sprinkles and you don't really intend to make any more changes, what you can do is just select the mesh that's been created by Mesh, bit of a mouthful, and then just press Ctrl-D to duplicate it. Then once you're done and you don't want to use the mesh network anymore, make sure you save at this point. If you want to save a new file, that's okay, because after this step you won't be able to go back. We can go ahead and delete the mesh network. And then we now just have our sprinkles on top. For the time being, I'm not going to, because I like to just keep that intact. One thing I would also make sure you don't do is don't go to delete all history, because if I were to do that, sometimes that will remove the mesh network, okay? So I would encourage you not to do that while you're working on this, until you're happy that it's all done. But yeah, that's how you can very, very quickly add sprinkles to the top of your icing. It doesn't work quite as well as it does with Blender's geometry nodes. They're just a lot more powerful. You might be able to do it with something like Bifrost, but that's for another tutorial. But yeah, thank you very much for watching. That's a brief intro to Mesh and how to add sprinkles to your donut, and I'll see you in the next part tomorrow, where we look at actually adding some shading and some textures to our donut. Thank you very much for watching. Hello and welcome back to part 3 of our donut modeling tutorial in Maya. So last we left off, we just added a bunch of sprinkles to the top of the icing using Mesh, and in today's video we're going to take a look at actually creating the materials, the shaders, and doing a little bit of lighting as well. First things first, we need to go ahead and create a light. One of the lights I like to use the most when we're just testing shaders and things is a dome light. So I'm going to come to Arnold over here, and I am just going to create a sky dome light. Okay, so if now I come up to renderer and just go to Arnold, we can now just render this as is in our scene, and we have a little bit of lighting to look at as well. But one of the better ways to do this is if we actually go to our dome light in the attribute editor under color, just press this button here, and then we can add in a HDR image. Essentially, that's just an image, a 360-degree kind of panorama image like this, that's been taken, and it's going to be used as the light source, and we'll provide links in the description on where to get some good free ones. That's what this one is here. A few little settings that will change as well is we'll just reduce the max bounces from 999 down to 10, because 999 is way too high. It's just going to make the render take longer, and we'll leave it around something like that. Now if I go ahead and render this again, you can now see we're getting a little bit more shadow information, and it just looks a lot more interesting than it did before. If you don't want to see this image in the background, by the way, which I often don't, just come back to the attribute editor with your sky dome light selected and put 0 in the camera instead, and then just deselect it there, and then we don't have to look at that anymore. Another thing I like to do as well is just come down to viewport, also put 0 in the sky radius. That way we can't accidentally select it unless we pick it from the attribute editor here. So yeah, that's how we're going to preview our textures. We'll just go ahead and go back to viewport 2.0. And yeah, let's get started. So for the time being, we just want to add a texture to the donut itself. So I'm just going to hide the icing and the mesh that we created. And I'm going to hold down right click on this, go to assign new material, Arnold, and then open PBR surface. Okay. So now that's just going to look white because that's the default color of this texture. And then let's just rename it something like donut shader. Okay, so to begin with, we're going to want to add a sort of donut-y looking color. So we're going to go to yellow to begin with, and then go a bit more into the orange. Maybe bring some of the intensity down a little bit on that and make it a bit darker. Maybe a bit more orange. Maybe something kind of like this. Just play around with this to get a kind of like color closer to whatever reference you're following. I'm going to go with something kind of like this, like a golden-y, crispy sort of color. And that's okay, but we're missing that line, like that lighter line down the middle, which you get, I think, from the way donuts are cooked, right? Like they're normally just placed in oil, and the tops and bottoms sort of cook quicker than everything else, so you get this sort of like slightly less cooked line in the middle. So how do we add that? Well, if you come to this little blue ball here, this is the Hypershade editor, open it up, you're going to be presented with a window like this, okay? By default, it's probably going to be blank, and we want to be able to see our texture. So if we come up to this material window up here, you can see we have our donut shader. Just click that, and it'll be highlighted yellow, and then press this button just to graph that for us. So to do this, we're actually going to create something called a ramp. So if you just type in ramp, you want to take in the AI ramp RGB, okay? By default, this is going to be black and white, but go ahead and just plug that into the base color. Now, by default, you're not going to see anything, but if we just go ahead and render this so that we can see what's happening. If I adjust this line here, you can now see that it's going up towards the top. Okay, you can see the black is taking more of an effect. If I was to bring the white all the way down, you can see it gets a lot brighter. So if you just press this little arrow here, that's going to bring up the window. So what we actually want to do is swap over this black color to the color we just created for our donut. If I click in this box here, we'll have the color history from the ones that we just made, so I'm going to pick that. And I'm going to do the same for this one here as well. We'll just make that the same color. So now our donut is the same color that we created before. Maybe a little bit brighter, actually. So I might just darken that down slightly. Take it back to where we were. Something like that, okay? Now, how do we add the line in the middle? So if I just click in the middle of this grid, you can see it adds another point. And if I change the color of this to something a bit brighter, maybe something like this, you can now see the whole donut starts to brighten up. But if we drag these points like this, closer to the middle, okay, you can see we're going to start to get a bit of a line forming in the middle of the donut. Okay, it's a bit faint at the moment, but you can see now we have this line forming. That's because if you think about it, it's basically the ramp is represented on the model here. So we have the darker brown bits up here, and then the lighter whiter bit in the middle. So if I was to make that completely white, you can see that's way more obvious. So we're going to play around with the colors just a little bit to make this a little better looking. Maybe I'll make this have a bit more color to it. Something like this. Okay, and then maybe we'll change the smoothing. You can change the interpolation, which is basically just kind of how, you know, how much it smooths the difference between the 2 points. So if I change that to none, then you can see we've got this quite harsh line, but we don't really want that. So we can maybe pull back a little bit here. So that's how you can kind of very quickly add a line in the middle, and you can adjust this, you know, maybe you want the line to be a bit less obvious, a bit more smooth, just pull those points away, or if you want it to be a bit sharper, just pull them closer, kind of like that. Okay, and then you can just change the color of that as well, if you want that to be much, much brighter. Okay, I think I'm going to make mine a bit brighter. Something like that. So that's how you do that, and we could take this a step further, and we can actually model this in slightly as well. If I kind of pull this back a bit so that this line kind of lines up around with the center of the donut. Like so, okay? And then if I just do an edge select, just select this, and then if I just scale this in a little bit, you can see that makes that crease a lot more defined, and you do kind of get that on donuts, right? They have this kind of dip in here. So already this is looking a lot more like a donut than we had, and literally all we're using is just a ramp with a few different colors and a slight tweak to the geometry. So I'm actually happy at this point to go ahead and close that, and you can play around with that a little bit more if you want to experiment more with the colors here. So for the time being, we're going to open back up our Hypershade editor, and what if we want to add a bit of color variation to our donut, right? To the parts which aren't in the middle of this white line here. So to do that, we can actually go ahead and plug another texture map or image file or noise or something like that into these colors on the ramp. So a lot of this kind of node-based thing, once you get used to it, is quite intuitive. Things just sort of plug into each other, and you do have to play around with it a long time to see what works and what doesn't. But to add some color variation here, what we can do is if you press tab again and just type in noise, we'll just take a default noise texture like this. Okay, and if you just click on that, you can see it has this sort of pattern that we're going to use to drive some sort of like color difference, right? Because when we were looking at the reference of our donut, it was sort of brown, but it had these reddish spots in it as well. So we're going to use this to actually replicate that. By default, it's black and white, but if you open it up, come to the right-hand side under color gain, just change that to the color you were using for your donut. Okay, and the color offset is going to be the black points, okay, or the darker points. So we can mess around with this to create a new sort of color or texture map for our donut. So to plug that in, what we're going to do is select the ramp, okay, make sure that you have one of the points selected which corresponds to your donut color, not the center ring line. Okay, middle mouse click and drag the noise over to the selected color. Okay, and then we'll do the same for the other side as well. So now, essentially what this is doing is it's using this noise texture to apply to the color on our ramp. So if with the noise texture selected, if I come back to our render, you can now see we're getting what looks like kind of a dirty, moldy donut. So what this will mean is we just need to tweak the colors a little bit again. So we can just spend a bit of time doing that. Just to add a bit more kind of difference here. Okay, and then we can also adjust the frequency of the noise to make that a bit more extreme or less extreme. I think I'm going to make it a little bit less extreme. Maybe something like this. And we can also adjust the threshold, which is sort of how extreme that noise texture is going to be. The amplitude as well, which also adjusts how extreme it is. the depth max, which sort of like how detailed each like part of the noise is. I might bump that up to like 4. Okay. And maybe just play with the color a little bit more. You can also change the type of noise here. By default, it's set to billow, but I generally like to use a purlin noise. I think it just looks a little bit more even and more interesting. And that's looking okay. Maybe a bit too much, so I might reduce the amplitude just a little bit. Maybe something like that. So we're just adding a little bit of color variation, right? Nothing crazy. Just something to kind of break up the color slightly. So it's not all just one tone. Okay, so that's the colors, but what if we want to actually add some bumpiness to this? And right now it's also looking very shiny as well, a bit like a plastic donut, right? So how can we change that? So if you come back to our Hypershade editor, okay, we have the specular roughness. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new noise texture. Okay. And we're going to plug that into the specular roughness. Now, this kind of defines how reflective or rough an object is. And for this, we actually can't just plug the color straight in. If you were to try that, you would see it just goes gray and we can't plug it in. Right, only lets you plug it into a few different things. What we actually want to do is just expand this color here with the plus, and you see we've got color, out color R, G, and B, red, green, and blue. We're going to want to take the out color red and just plug that into the specular roughness on its own. Okay. And then just select the noise texture so that we can edit that. So if we now come back to our render view, you can see we're getting a bit more of an interesting pattern in the reflection, right? It now looks like some parts are really, really rough, whereas some parts are a little bit more reflective. If I go ahead and change it over to a purlin noise, you can see we now have a much more interesting reflection. And if you look at things like donuts, you know, they might have leftover oil or kind of grease on them, or just any like minor differences in the surface could make the shininess kind of varied, right, on the donut. So go ahead and play around with this a little bit. You can increase the frequency if you wanted to, and then adjust things like the color gain. If you to reduce this, it looks like it's coated in some sort of syrup, which is pretty cool. And if that's what you want to go for, you can certainly do that. I'm probably going to keep it around about here. The color offset as well, which is kind of like is going to make everything look a bit more rough. And the threshold as well. So play around a little bit with these settings, see what each one does. I want my donut to have a little bit of shine to it. Nothing too crazy. Something like this. Maybe I'll increase the color offset a little bit and then reduce the color gain. Just to make that a little less contrasty. Put a bit more shine into it. Okay, maybe something like that. So there's a bit of a drier looking donut if we go with something like that, which is okay. So it's just kind of about experimenting with your settings, playing around with them, getting what you like. But it just, you know, if we look at it from this angle, you can see the light's just reflecting a bit nicer off of the donut. Okay, and that goes a long way to making it look a bit more realistic, a bit more like an actual donut. But now, the surface is looking incredibly smooth, right? And if you look at the surface of a donut, it's not really that smooth. I mean, they you know, you'll get, depending on how they're made, they could look a little bit different. But this is looking more like a kind of like super duper smooth cartoony bagel. We want to add a bit more of a like cakey, spongy texture to this. So what we can do is if we come back to our Hypershade editor, okay, just move some of these out of the way, and then press tab again and just type in bump. And we're going to take an AI bump 2D node, okay, and put the out value into the normal camera down here. And then we're going to create another noise texture. So we're doing a lot of this procedurally. instead of using texture maps, we're just creating noise and using the default UVs and then using that to create a procedural texture that doesn't actually require us to do any UVs or anything like that. So it's a bit simpler and it works quite well for food items like a donut. So we're going to go ahead and take the out color red again and just plug that into the bump map. Okay. So by default, the bump height is set really low, 0.010, okay? And with that, you actually can't really see any sort of difference. So if you just start gradually increasing this, if I was to whack this all the way up to 1, we now have what looks like a very, very rocky looking donut, okay? So you want to find a sort of middle ground for this, and by default the noise isn't really doing much for us, it doesn't really work. But you can see now we have a bit of texture on the donut itself. So if we come back to our noise texture, just select that so that we can preview it on the right, and then come back so that we can adjust this and see it on the fly. We're going to change the noise type again to a Perlin noise. Okay, and then maybe we'll increase the frequency up to something a fair bit higher, like 33 or something like that. Okay, and then from here we can just start tweaking the settings. Okay, and again, these things do various different things depending on what you do. I might reduce the DAF max down to something like 2. Maybe reduce the amplitude a little bit. I'm just looking to add a bit of bumpiness, nothing crazy. Okay, now if we look from this view with the light reflecting off of it, we have a much more interesting looking surface. It doesn't look quite as plain as it did. Maybe we'll reduce that down to 0.05. Some of these values don't really have to be particularly high. It's just about being sort of subtle. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. What if now we wanted to do the same thing for our icing? So we'll go ahead and enable the icing. And that's just looking nice and grey now. But we'll do what we did before. We'll select it, go ahead, right-click, assign new material, Arnold, and then open PBR surface. Okay. And then for this, let's just have it a nice solid color. I think I might go with a sort of chocolate icing type color. So we're looking to create a brownish, reddish color. Something like this, okay? You could make it pink as well if you want to. That might be a bit too electric pink. I wouldn't need that. That looks kind of radioactive. But something like this, if that's what you want to do, go ahead. You don't have to follow this exactly. But I'm going to go for a chocolatey sort of coating like this. Okay, and then we can do the exact same thing we did with the donut. We can also plug in some noise textures into the roughness for this. So if we come back to our Hypershade editor, you'll now see that we have this new texture here. It might be on top of things, so we'll just move that out of the way. Down to here. And I could go ahead and actually duplicate this noise texture. If I just select this one here that says noise 2 and just come up to edit and then duplicate and then shading network, that will then duplicate that for us. And then we can take the color red and plug that into the specular roughness as well. Come back to our scene, you can see we now have that there too, but that's looking a bit too dry. I think I want the icing to look a bit more shiny. So maybe we'll adjust this a little bit. Reduce the color gain. We just want this one to be a little bit more subtle. Just a bit of variation. Okay, and then I might not plug any bump into this. Just keep it nice and sort of smooth. We can see now already we're getting something that looks a little bit more accurate. We've got that nice ring around here. We've got some color breakup in the donut. We've got some specular roughness on both the donut and the icing. So the last thing to do would be to add some textures to our sprinkles. So if we go ahead and re-enable the sprinkles, they just have a default gray material. But what if we want these to have all sorts of different colors? So to do that, we can create 3 different shaders. So we have our original sprinkles down here. If I were to add a new material to, say, this first sprinkle here, okay, assign new material, Arnold, and then open PBR surface. And if I just change the color of this to, like, pink, you can see all the sprinkles in the mesh network, which are using this first sprinkle, have now also adjusted to the same color. And this is why we kept the mesh network, because it's going to allow us to adjust the sprinkle color on the fly. So if we go ahead and just rename this Sprinkle Shader 1. Okay, maybe we'll keep these as pink. I quite like that. Reduce the intensity of that a little bit. Maybe for the next ones we'll have blue sprinkles, so we'll select the next one in the list. Apply a new shader. Okay, and then this will be Sprinkle Shader 2. And then from here we'll pick a blue. Reduce that a little bit so it's not so radioactive looking. And then for Sprinkle Shader 3, we'll do the exact same thing. Arnold, open PBR surface, rename that again. It's a good idea to rename your shaders as you're making them as well, because you can see we've already got a fair few, right, for each different part, and it can get a bit confusing if you're not sure what which one's which. Maybe for these, we'll... something kind of reddish color like this. Okay, that's a little bit hideous looking, but you get the idea. So now we've gone ahead and very, very quickly added different colors to all of our sprinkles. Actually, you know what? I don't quite like that being red. Let's make these a bit more white color. Like that. Okay. You could even, if you want to, go ahead and plug a normal map into each of these sprinkles, right? Like if I pull up the Hypershade editor, maybe pull up the Sprinkle 1 shader. We go ahead and create a new AI Bump 2D. Get another noise. Plug that into our bump map. And then just increase the bump height. You can see now we're getting a bit of bumpiness on the sprinkles, basically for free, and it's not really going to impact much of the render time at all. When you zoom out, it's not going to be quite as obvious, but you can really go quite far with the detail with this. Very, very granular, and improve things as much, really, as you want, or as little as you want, whether or not you want it to be stylized or quite realistic looking. So yeah, that's how you add shaders to your donut. I hope you have enjoyed this episode. The next part will be coming out tomorrow, part 4, where we'll look at actually rendering and doing the final lighting and saving out a finished rendered image for our donut. So yeah, thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you again tomorrow. Bye-bye. Hello and welcome back to the 4th and final part of our donut modeling tutorial in Maya. So last we left off, we added a bunch of sprinkles to the top of our icing using mesh. I've gone ahead and just finalized that, basically just by duplicating the sprinkles and then deleting the mesh network, and that saves everything for you. We also added shaders to our donut. In this video, we're going to take a look at just doing a bit of some basic lighting and also how to render and save out your image. So how do we do lighting in Arnold? So to create a light, what you want to come and do is come up to the Arnold tab up here, and this section here is where all your lights are. So there's a few different types. We have a regular area light. If you go ahead and create one of those, I'll just pull that up, you'll see that will be this little square here. This is kind of just like your basic light in Arnold, okay? It's your sort of do-it-all light. This light kind of features basically in any render engine, Blender, with Eevee and Cycles, and you know, whether or not we're using any other kind of render engine in any software, you're always going to have a kind of light like this, and this can function as just essentially like your most basic of lights in real life too. If we come to the attribute editor on the right hand side, you can see we have a whole host of settings, from the color of the light, the intensity, the exposure, color temperature, spread, resolution, samples, soft edges, and all these other things. Also visibility as well, right? So we'll get into what these do in a little bit. There's a few other light types as well, like mesh light, which will essentially, if you were to apply this to a mesh, right, like if I clicked on this donut, well, let's go with the icing. It will essentially just turn that into a light source. You can see it's made it transparent if you want to create some sort of glowing donut, but that's not what we're going to do today. There's a few other types of lights as well, like a photometric light and a sky dome light, which is what we used in the last episode to help us preview our shaders. And we'll go into that again a little bit here. But to begin with, we're going to start by just using an area light. And we're going to set up one of the most simple and effective lighting setups, which is 3-point lighting. Now, if you spent any time in photography or 3D, you've probably heard of a 3-point lighting setup. Essentially, like the name suggests, it's where you have 3 lights, and they all have different names and kind of different purposes. So you might have a key light, okay, a fill light, and a backlight. So to kind of demonstrate this, let's just start creating a 3-point lighting setup, and we'll see why it works, what it's good for. So we'll place this first light off over here. Maybe we'll rotate it a little bit to point towards our donut. Okay, and we'll come up to render, and we'll just press on Arnold. And that will start rendering. And by default, you're not going to see anything. Okay, it's just going to be black. Unless I move this light really, really close to the donut, but even then, you know, you can see we're barely getting any light whatsoever. It's because when you create a light, you can see the intensity is set to 1, the exposure to 0, and essentially, it's not really giving out much light at all. So to actually increase the brightness of the light, we could just go ahead and increase the intensity. If I whack this up to like 10 here, you can see it's still not doing a whole lot though, right? It illuminates our donut a little bit brighter than it did before, but it's still not doing much. What you actually want to adjust is the exposure. And the reason for that is because adjusting the exposure kind of works a bit more like how a light works in real life. It works in terms of more like photographic stops, right? So each one that we increase doubles the light output. So if I was to put the exposure to 1, that's actually doubling the output of the light, okay? If I was to increase this to 10, you can see now we're getting a much, much brighter light than we did just with the intensity slider alone, okay? In simple terms, you can make your light. In simple terms, you can make your light much brighter without adding, you know, insane values like 100 in the intensity. You can use lower values. So if we increase this to something like 15 and just pull this back, it might be a tad bit too bright. Maybe let's go for like 13 or something like that. You can see it's illuminating our donut quite nicely, even from this far away. But we are still getting some dark spots. But in a 3-point lighting setup, this is what is known as the key light. The primary purpose of this light is it's the main light source of your light setup. It's going to be the most intense and it's direct, right? So you can see how we have it pointing directly at the donut. And it's, you know, it's ideally going to be illuminating your subject, like whether that's an actor or in our case, a big donut. The second light source, we'll just go ahead and duplicate this one with Control D and move this to the other side. Okay, point that at the donut. That's known as the fill light. So this is more used just to cancel out the shadows created by the key light. It's not really meant to create its own shadows. It's less powerful than the key light, and we place it opposite to the key light. So we'll go ahead and bump down the exposure on this. Maybe we'll reduce that to something like 10. We can always play with the values afterwards. Okay. And you imagine that your camera is going to be somewhere between these two lights. So we would assume the camera is somewhere in here. Okay. And the final light that you want to create is what's called a backlight, a hair light, or a rim light. Essentially just because it goes behind your donut. We'll just turn off the render for the time being so we can see where all the lights are placed. So this is where the idea of the 3 points comes from, right? So you have the fill light, or the fill light shooting this way, the key light shooting this way, and then the rim light or the backlight literally behind your subject, right? So this is also typically placed a bit higher than your subject, so we might put it up here. And you can make the color quite bright, but you can also feel free to adjust this however you like. We'll go ahead and re-render again there. And you can see now what happens is if I look at the donut from this angle, we're getting our main light source from the left-hand side, right, with the key light. We're getting a little bit of light from the right-hand side from the fill light, just to make those shadows less intense. And you see how we have this quite bright highlight on the top? That's coming from our rim light, and that's where it kind of gets the name, because it just highlights the back rim of your donut. It's also called a hair light sometimes when working with people, because, you know, it just illuminates some of that hair. And this is why you place it above, because we're getting that rim lighting on the top of the donut. If I was to place it way down here, you can see we're not really getting a whole lot, just slight little bits on the edge. But you kind of want it a bit higher than your subject. So we're getting this nice background light. And one of its main purposes is to separate our donut from the background. Right? If I was to hide that, you can see how our donut just blends into the black here. But when we turn that back on, it really pops out from the background, doesn't it? So that's the main purpose of the rim light. So that is your basic light setup. Okay? And now that we have that in place, what can we do to make our render a little bit more interesting? So what I like to do is I've grouped everything together and I've just called that donut, call it whatever you like. And let's create a camera to frame our subject. So we're going to come up to create camera and then camera. There we go. And we're just going to pull that back. Okay. If you press space on your keyboard, or you can press this button over here to come to the same view. and then go to, in whatever other view you want to change your camera to. I typically like to use this one here. Go to view and then cycle through camera. That will then switch the view to your newly created camera. Okay, so if you can see, if I move this around now, you can see the view here changing as we move our camera. Okay, you can also just move the camera like you would the perspective camera. If we come into here, right now I'm just holding down Alt and middle mouse to pan around. We can zoom out and orbit as well. You can also adjust the settings like you would with a cube from here. If I was to change the rotate, that also works. One of the best practices to do, though, when you're using a camera and you're rendering, is you actually want to turn on something called the resolution gate. I'm just going to press this button up here, and you can see how it's added these white blocks or gates on the either side. Essentially what this is doing is it's showing you the framing of the camera and the final output of the camera. So this kind of 16:9 aspect ratio that we have in this window isn't what the final output of the render is going to be. Turning on the resolution gate shows you actually what the camera is going to be seeing and what we'll be able to save out as an image once we render. So let's go ahead and position our camera. You can do that either by moving it in this viewport here. I like to do it from the actual camera itself, so I'm just going to press space on here. And we'll look at it kind of straight on, like so. Let's also change the position of our donut, because right now this is a bit boring. So you kind of want to be thinking kind of about composition, right? Like, let's say you were making an advertisement and you wanted to display this donut. Would you necessarily just display it exactly from the side like this? Probably not, right? You'd might be looking at it down a little bit like this, so you can see more of the overall shape. But maybe we could do something a little bit more fun, and we can actually rotate the donut a little bit, right? Maybe we have it at an angle like this, so it just looks a little bit more dynamic. Make sure that we can see a good amount at the bottom, but also the icing on top. You could, you know, rotate it around a little bit. Maybe you have some drip somewhere that you'd rather be a bit more of a focal point. I'm going to keep it like this, but you can see how already just changing the angle of the donut makes it look like a slightly more interesting composition. Okay. Now if we go ahead and render this from this view, you can see that our lights are still working, but we might need to change the position of a few different things. So one thing that I would like to do while I'm like setting up a lighting setup is I'll just press space, and we can keep this render going in this view down here. Okay, you can even resize this window if you want to. And then while this is rendering, we can still just move the lights around freely in the viewport here, in the perspective viewport. So I might bring this light a bit closer over to this side to get us some highlights here on the left hand side with our key light. And then what I might do is bring our rim light a bit closer. And now that we've changed the position of the donut, it might be a bit too high. Maybe we'll bring that down slightly. Okay. And we can change the positions of some of these lights a little bit. Or we don't want it to be as bright on the right-hand side, just to have some contrast. Okay, and you can see already we've got a relatively interesting lighting setup. It's not just plain and boring. And, you know, we could increase the intensity of this rim light. If we wanted that highlight to be really, really strong, maybe we could whack that up to like 15 or something. But you just want to watch out for things getting blown out, which is essentially just when it's so bright, things just become white and you can't see them properly anymore. But I quite like this. I think this is looking quite nice. I did mention that we could use HDRI, we could use a sky dome light, and while we could do that, they generally provide sort of less control over the exact lighting setup, particularly when you're doing more like subject or product photography setups, kind of like this. Just because they're illuminating more naturally, like you're in an exterior space. They're great if you're doing reflective things like a metal and you need some sort of reflections, right? But for something like this, it's not really necessary, and we're going to get a lot more control just over having our own lights like this that we can move around and, you know, change like to whatever kind of setup that we'd like, right? Instead of just having a one big overall light, which acts more like a sun or a room or something. We could adjust some of these settings as well to your heart's desire, basically just for however you want this to be. We could reduce the fill light to make this a bit more moody, or we can just keep it as it is to keep it nice and bright. You could make it real kind of like old school cinema, if like maybe we massively bump up the rim light exposure, but then reduce the exposure of the key light. It's quite like a dramatic, spacey looking shot of the donut, but it's really kind of up to you. I'm going to keep mine kind of like this. A good thing to do as well is to rename your lights to exactly what they are. So I'll just go ahead and rename this. So this will be the rim light. And then we've got the fill light over this side. And then the key light as well, just so you can keep track of those things. And that's just a good, way to keep things tidy, and you're seeing always name things, otherwise you're going to end up having a bunch of peaky ones and stuff like that. Okay, so now that we have the lighting set up the way we want, there's a few settings we can change just to speed things up. So when you create a light, by default, the max number of bounces is going to be 999. This is kind of just how many times the light rays coming out of the light are going to bounce around on a subject, or in 3D space, right? Like, if you imagine how light works in real life, the light rays hit things and bounce off of them, and they gradually get absorbed depending on the material properties. This is way too high for what we need, and you won't be able to notice the difference, so I typically like to decrease this down to something like 10, and that is just going to improve the speeds of our render times quite a lot. Not that it takes too much time to render to begin with. Let's just pause the render for the time being. The next thing we can do is take a look at the actual render settings. We're going to come up to this little cog and box up here. And under common, there's a few things that we can look at, like the renderable camera. I've just got that set to render cam, which is the one that we created already. You could select the perspective camera as well, but typically you want to set that to whichever camera you're going to be rendering from. The image size as well, there's a bunch of different presets in here. I currently have it at a 2000 by 2000 grid. You could scroll down and do HD 1080. You can see how our resolution gate has changed there, so maybe we'll go with that. And that gives you an idea of what you're going to be able to see in your final image. So I'll just zoom in a little bit. The next thing to take a look at is under Arnold Renderer. We've got a whole bunch of different settings here, right? Like the camera AA, the diffuse, the specular. Essentially, this is how many samples the render engine is going to be using to create the image. I think the default camera AA is free, and that should generally work well for most applications. With the modern version of Arnold, it has a built-in denoiser under images down here. Images, sorry. So a camera AA of free should be good. Ideally, you want to keep this as low as possible, but the defaults are a great starting point. I wouldn't really go any lower than 2 for the diffuse, right? So the samples here on diffuse and specular, as the name might suggest, 2 is how many samples are going to be used to render diffuse. Diffuse just being the color of your image, so if you think like the pinks and blues of the sprinkles, that's a diffuse. The specular, how shiny it is, so you can see it reflecting a little bit there off of the material. Transmission as well is how translucent, or the translucency properties, translucency samples. It's not really necessary for this, since our donut isn't translucent. Otherwise, it would not really be a very good donut. And then subsurface scattering and volume indirect. We don't need to worry about that today. So these are just decent settings to have to begin with, and we'll just leave it at that. So how do we actually go ahead and render this and save out an image? So we're going to come up in the Arnold tab. We're going to press on this button here with this eye, and make sure that your render cam is selected up here. Okay, so I'm going to change that to render cam shape. And then we're just going to press the play button up here. Sometimes it will select the wrong camera to begin with, so you might need to change that. Okay, there's a bit of a bug sometimes, so it thinks the shape, the camera we created, even though it's called render cam, is camera shape 1, so we're just going to select that one from here. Okay, and you can see that rendered in about 7 seconds with those settings. And that really didn't take much time at all, right? It's quite quick. Your mileage may vary. I have a reasonably powerful computer. One thing to make sure you do before you render as well is make sure you have smooth previewed everything, just to keep that nice and round. We don't want to see any sort of hard edges, unless it's the style you're going for. We don't need to do the same for the sprinkles. They're so small that you won't really be able to tell anyway. So yeah, that is how you render your image. If you want to save it, just come up to File and then go to Save Image. Okay, and then you can name that whatever you want. Maybe we could call that donut.png, something like that. Hit Save. Then if I just navigate to where that was, we now have our donut render. Okay, and that saves with a transparent background as well. So yeah, that's been a brief intro to Maya while creating a donut. Obviously everyone knows the famous Blender donut tutorial. I thought it'd just be fun to do a little bit of a tutorial version of it in Maya, since some people had requested it, and we made a donut recently just for a short video, just for fun. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and got something out of it. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. We'll happily answer basically any question at all, unless it's really weird. And yeah, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.